Welcome to the continuation of the Secret Team readings written by Fletcher Prouty. We're on page 87 at the bottom of the right-hand page. These were not simply the comments of one man. They were typical and they were indicative of the thinking and of the intentions of the official elected leaders of the United States. Right after the end of World War II and of their deep-seated opposition, great forces were working to divide the world and to set up one half as communist and the other half free world and anti-communist. There was the inertial drift that was transferring an initiative to the Kremlin. The source of most of our problems of the past 25 years, and certainly of the grave problems that beset our country today, lies in the schism between those who believed in the traditional school of national planning and overt diplomacy and those who believed in a passive role of reaction to a general enemy, communism. This later school would operate in response to intelligence inputs without plans and without national objectives, would hide everything it did in secrecy, and would justify its actions in all instances as being anti-communist. On the other hand, there were those who believed that the United States was the new leader of the world, and that its responsibility to its own people and to those of the rest of the world lay in making a better world for all mankind along the lines of the example of the United States tradition. At its best, this represented the dreams of free men for liberty and individual freedom under law and justice. The maintenance of such a world and the expansion of such conditions to other parts of the world would require planning and great effort. The regional concept of the Marshall Plan was an example of the best that such endeavors can accomplish in the face of communist threats and opposition. Communism was met head-on in Europe right after World War II and was defeated in France and Italy without resort to war and without response mechanism. Communism was beaten by superior U.S. planning and policy. However, this kind of international effort requires dedicated leadership and great effort. One of the most difficult things for any government to do is develop and carry out long-range plans. That takes a certain inspired vision and rare leadership that is not often available. On the other hand, it is easier and more typical to react and respond to outside pressures than to act in accordance with approved plans. In a modern government vested with immense capacity and advanced communications, it can be made to look more effective to set up and operate from a feedback system that will respond almost automatically to inputs, most of which are derived from a new-style comprehensive intelligence information system fed by bits of data from everything including agent-to-satellite photography and other sophisticated sensors. The government in this case defines a threat, real or imagined, and responds to each data input from the threat and the danger. This is what has been developed. And at this stage of the system, this has become a normal course. Therefore, since it was all but inevitable that there would be a power struggle of some kind between the two great power centers on Earth, even without declared hostility, the intelligence community's proponents, and that it would be easier to begin our national defense posture by delineating the source of all concern and danger, i.e. world communism, and then to draw lines for a never-ending battle, sometimes called the Cold War. They're really trying to get me to not talk this talk right now. The line of constructed was in the beginning the Iron Curtain, although one might expect that the battles would be waged by our forces on their side of the curtain and the skirmishes by their forces would be on our side. It has not turned out that way. The battles that have been fought since 1947, for the most part, have been fought on our side of the Iron Curtain. It happened this way because the intelligence community has gained the initiative and the response technique will not work on the other side. This was a great contest, and although the principles on both sides of the argument, which was of such vital concern to the foreign policy and defense posture of this country, might deny it, this was the basis for the contention of the Central Intelligence Group should be assigned to a position subordinate to the Secretaries of State and Defense and under their direction. These two pressure groups have vied for power repeatedly since 1946. It has entirely possible that the leak of the Anderson papers in December of 71 and January of 72 was current evidence of an outbreak of this continuing struggle. Henry Kissinger is the titular head of the intelligence community clandestine operations reaction faction. His appearance as a one-man power center is simply due to the fact that he fronts for the secret team and the secret intelligence community, as he vies with the secret Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and certain others in the traditionalist group who would like to see a return to national planning, strong diplomacy, and moves toward peace through successful conferences between the United States and other countries of the world. The traditionalists had finally found a long-awaited opportunity to exploit Kissinger's weakened position in the India-Pakistani war to expose him. Such events will occur repeatedly with the ebb and flow of power between these two positions. As we continue with the development of the CIA and the ST in the following chapters, we shall see many more examples of the active versus passive contest. Section 3, a simple coup d'etat to a global mechanism. For nothing is hid that shall not be made manifest, nor anything secret that shall not be known and come to light. Take heed then how you hear. Luke 8:17-18. A modern parable. The jet airliner had just left the runway with the ex-president of Gandia aboard and was winging its way over the snowballed Andes. In less than 2 hours, it would land in the capital of Pagon, where the ex-president had been assured of asylum and safety. In a remote office in Washington, the watch officer awaited an expected word from the agent who had arranged the flight, confirming that the departure had taken place. It was too soon to expect the collateral news that General Alfredo El Ciario Ilona had secured the reins of the government in Gandia. The news he would get as soon as the second agent arrived in the capital with the new president. Desk officers had worked all night preparing releases for the news media and sending instructions to its operatives, readying them to support General Alexario's new government. In distant Gandia, all was quiet in spite of all of a sudden coup d'etat. It may have been the quiet before the storm. For the time being, all had gone well. In the cabin of an old converted transport C-47, General Alexario was sleeping off the effects of a heavy drinking bout on an army-style cot that had been fitted into a modest VIP airplane. As soon as the plane had landed on its return from the frontier outpost, the pilot had parked it behind the U.S. Air Force surplus World War II hangar. The general and his closest friends had not even left the plane. Their party had continued on through the night in the plane. The pilot and friend of the general, a U.S. Air Force major, had sent the others home while he stayed until the general had slept it off. As he tidied up the plane and recalled similar days in Greece and Iran, where he had worked as the mission commander on other exercises for Acme Plumbing. But this was the first time that he himself had been the key agent in the making of a president. It had been hard work, and now all he had to do was wait for the brilliant mountain sunrise and word from the embassy and that all was well and that the city was under control. In a few hours, the general would be awakened and prepared to enter a capital for this new president. Now, as he lay there on the crude cot, he did not know that the coup d'etat had already taken place and that it had been completely successful. The major had been in Gandia for slightly more than 1 year. He had come to join the U.S. Air Force mission there after 6 months and accelerating training in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. He had flown little since his duty in Korea, but it had been come back quickly with the intensive program the CIA had scheduled for him there. At Eglin, he had learned new pair-drop techniques and had dropped closely with the newly formed Special Air Warfare Squadrons. One squadron had been sent to South Vietnam, another had gone to Europe, and the one he was to join had flown to Panama. There he had received further operational training exercises with the U.S. Army Special Forces troops in Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Other operations had taken him on an earthquake mercy mission to Peru in a medical team pair-drop exercise into a mining town in Bolivia. It was while he was in Bolivia that the Western Hemisphere Division had contacted him through the embassy and told him to report to Gandia. Not long after he had arrived in Gandia, he met General El Ciario. The general had been working with a specially equipped transport plane doing paradrop work over the mountain forest of the eastern frontier. One of the most frequently used unclassified code names for the CIA in general conversation by employees and those familiar with their intimate jargon note how the White House Watergate affair group called themselves the Plumbers, showing their CIA lineage. The general was from a leading family of Gandia and could trace his ancestry back to the days of Simon Bolivar. Yet he was proud of the fact that he was a Gandian and made slight reference to his Castilian ancestry. He loved that squat, barrel-chested mountain people. He was one of them. He was a man of the people, and he was the most famous flyer in the country. He had flown serum to stricken villages during an epidemic, and he had dropped tons of relief supplies after an earthquake. The people of the villages loved the general, even though he was not a favorite in the capital. As in most Latin American countries, the government centered in the capital. What took place in the capital was important. What took place in the villages could be ignored. When the general was made the chief of staff of the Gandian Air Force, the old president thought he had made a safe assignment. The general was part of no clique in the city, and he was no threat to anyone. From the first, the general and his U.S. major got along fine. The major preferred the men of the villages to those in the capital, and in no time at all he was popular. Whenever he went, the general too was popular. Wherever he went, the general too was popular. In this remote site, the major had become the friend of everyone in the village and in the Gandian Air Force unit. The general had noticed that the units the major worked with always seemed able to get supplies and favors which had been hard to get before his military aid channels. The major must have had some special influence with Washington. On the other hand, whenever the major distributed these hard-to-get items, he always credited the general with getting them the magic. This magic was simply a part of the long reach of the secret team. The major was on a CIA assignment, and although everything he did had the appearance of normal U.S. air duty, he was in Gandia to gather intelligence. He was part of a normal inside operation, and he knew who was on General El Ciaro's team, and he knew who was not. He knew which elements of the government worked with the Air Force and which were aloof or antagonistic. When his routine reports, which he filed daily through his contact in the embassy and not through Air Force channels, revealed that he was getting quite close to the general. They were passed on by the Deputy Director of Intelligence to the Deputy Director of Plans, and thence to Western Hemisphere. From the date on, WH monitored all traffic to and from the major, and from time to time would feed him special instructions and other data. WH wanted to know exactly whom the general trusted and who in the government he worked with on official matters. In Gandia, as in many other countries, this could mean who does he share his cut of government funds with and who shares theirs with him. One day, General El Ciario told the major of his growing displeasure with the government of the old president. This was passed on to WH. Day by day, the major increased the scope and coverage of the civic action training exercise that the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Army Forces troops were interested in, and that gave special credit to General El Ciario. He was seen everywhere with new projects to build rural schools. He was seen delivering water pipe to the remote village from an Air Force transport. His fighters roared over distant villages, distant cities and towns, letting the people know that the Air Force was everywhere. General El Ciario opened the new U.S. satellite tracking station, and he was at the dedication ceremony of a new U.S. mining company airfield, and everywhere the general went, the major was somewhere in the background. The major found ways to be helpful to the general, and he gave the general an opportunity to widen the gap between himself and his government. Before long, the general was led to believe that the U.S. government was displeased with the old president, although nothing was ever said. General El Ciario was quite certain that if he made a move to take over the government, the U.S. government would not make a move to support the president regime. Note the formula. There was no commitment of any kind to support a coup d'etat. On the contrary, the formula calls only for tacit agreement not to support the incumbent. As a matter of fact, the major had been sent to Gandia to look out for subversive insurgency. The possibility of a coup had developed quite spontaneously, and once it became a possibility, it was nurtured. As soon as the general realized this, he began to see himself as the person in power. The lure was undeniable. He began to create his own team, and he began to count his chances. It was not long before he came to the major with the outline of a well-planned scheme that purported to see a real and immediate requirements for a big civic action exercise in a remote province. This exercise would require a special consignment of weapons, ammunition, and perhaps silver bullion to buy off some of the dissident tribesmen. General El Ciario made a good case for his plan and assured that the major that the natives would be properly stirred up at the right time to make it seem to everyone that this exercise was not only the real thing for training purposes, but that a government show of force in that area would help put down rampant communist-inspired subversion in the area. The only problem would be the weapons. The general had no way to get that much material without arousing suspicion. The incumbent government kept all munitions under close control and secured magazines. Otherwise, not a word was said about even the remote possibility of a coup d'etat. But both men, the U.S. major and the ambitious general, understood each other. That night, the messages from the embassy to WH were highly classified and loaded with instructions to include the request for munitions and airlift. WH was quick to respond. The neighboring country, Pejon, had been scheduled to receive a normal large shipment of military assistance munitions, and the CIA arranged to have these delivered ahead of schedule and to see the order with extra items for General. The U.S. Air Force was directed to make available 4 medium transport aircraft for the Gandian Air Force's civic action timing exercise. When all was in readiness, 2 large C-130 heavy 4-engine transport planes took off from Panama, bound by Pegon. However, they followed a devious flight plan in order to make some upper altitude weather tests for NASA. This gave them extra time en route. They landed in Pejon on schedule, but unknown to that government, they had touched down on a remote mountain airstrip long enough to dump off a number of pallets loaded with munitions for Gandia. The 2 C-130s were able to get back in the air with only a 30-minute delay and to make their scheduled arrival time at the original destination. No one knew that they had delivered this cache of arms for the rebels in Gandia. And the barren airstrip there had been only 4 men, all from the USAF. They had arrived unnoticed and unannounced in one of the U.S. Air Force Special Air Warfare U-10s Helio light aircraft. This rugged light plane was especially designed to land in short distances in rough terrain. Yet it could carry 6 men or 4 men and a cargo of special equipment. These men had set up panel signals to show the C-130s where to land. Then they had driven a number of heavy crowbars into the ground. To each one, they affixed the loop end of a long nylon rope with a hook at the end. And as soon as the C-130 had landed, they directed it to turn around and open its huge rear end cargo doors. The lines were passed into the crew and attached to pallets on which ammunition was firmly strapped. Then, as the C-130 gunned its engines for takeoff, the ropes pulled each pallet out of the plane and left a string of cargo on one side of the clearing. The process was repeated with the other C-130 on the other side of the clearing. No sooner had the C-130s left them for smaller C-123 medium transports arrived from Gandia, flying over the mountain ridges to escape detection. The first plane landed short and spun around, ready for takeoff. It carried a small forklift unit that was used to load all 4 planes. The whole operation had taken less than an hour, and just before the 4 men left in their Helio, one of them drove the forklift over the cliff at the edge of the runway. The C-123s hedgehoged to the remote airfield in preparation for the civic action exercise. 2 U.S. Army Special Forces advisors working with the tribes in the exercise area staged a pre-dawn attack using firefight packages along with a team of Gandian Army Special Forces who were told that they were in training exercises. The villagers were told this was a hostile attack and that the chieftain dutifully reported subversive insurgency to the district police headquarters in the nearest town. News spread to the capital and the sector was reported to be a rebellion. General El Ciario's field headquarters reported that they would put down the trouble and that all would be under control. The increased activity overlooked in the capital as one of those occasional native outbreaks. Then, under the cover of this emergency, the incumbent government was served with an ultimatum. Are you kidding me? A well-armed force of paratroops disembarked at the main airport and began to take over the national radio station and other government centers. Since they were heavily armed, the president assumed that they included men upon whom he had relied and who had keys to the ammunition magazines. He called in his United States CIA friend, who reluctantly confirmed that this was the case and the safe passage could be arranged for the president and his immediate family in Fawcett Airlines plane, which happened to be at the airport. In a matter of hours, the old president was on his way, and the courier drove onto the Gandian Air Force Base to inform the major that he could prepare El Ciario for his victory march onto the capital and to the presidential palace. Digressing a moment, I want to let you know that Jesse Ventura did the foreword of this book in a secret wink that he is part of the secret team, and he's ordered the death of one of our soldiers who was a marksman, sharpshooter that wrote a book, because they saw each other at a bar one night and Jesse Ventura abused the words of a military, and Chris called him out. And his ego was so bruised that he ordered Chris to be killed. And he speaks about it on the Joe Rogan show. What a wonderful leader you are. El Ciario served his country for several years, and he may have been replaced in the same manner. Meanwhile, the major has left for the other duties. If the general had the opportunity to visit the Guatemalan airfield, which was constructed on the ranch at Retalhuleu for the purpose of training Cuban air crews, he would have seen his old friend, the major, busy with his ex-Cuban airline pilots, trying to teach them how to fly the latest and most lethal model of the old B-26. Or he would have seen the major a while later at his primary support base in Arizona, where T-28s and other aircraft were being outfitted for Laos. Such men are members of a small, highly competent group of professionals who prepare the way for the operations dreamed up by the ST in any point of the world. The real day-to-day operational work of the ST and of its principal action organization, the CIA, is so different from that of ordinary arm of the government that it would be worth the time and space here to define it and explain it as it was revealed in the scenes just outlined. The coup d'etat described was a composite of real ones, although the names of these countries involved and the name of the general had changed. Oddly enough, the general did become president after an all-night party, and the major did have his hands full trying to get him ready for his victorious entry into town. The CIA had a full-time man in the embassy who was responsible for what might have been called routine intelligence. It was posted and noted that there was increasing opposition to the incumbent president, so an agency man was introduced into the country as an Army colonel. He was a Special Forces officer and well known in the U.S. Army as an instructor at Fort Bragg. Actually, he had been at Fort Bragg in the JFK Center on a CIA cover assignment. He had been in the Army during World War II, and he had a bona fide reserve commission. Technically, he was recalled to active duty, and he was paid by the CIA. And he was not on the basic Army roles except a cover assignment. When his special requirement in the Gandia arose, the CIA got him transferred to the Army mission in Gandia by suggesting that the incumbent Army colonel be called back to attend the National War College. This excuse satisfied the Army headquarters in Panama and enabled the cover colonel to take over the mission without delay. No sooner had this colonel reported for duty that the ambassador began a build-up program for him so that he would have a chance to meet the president frequently and to talk with him sufficiently to win him over to the U.S. Army doctrine on a civic action and to convince him that this could be applied to the rebellious areas and the border outposts. In this manner had become a confidant of the president and was very useful later during the coup d'etat. At about the same time that the Army colonel arrived in Gandia, an American businessman who was president of a small independent airline with its main offices in Panama came into the capital city to open a one-man office to represent his airline. He rented a small space at the airport and hired a clerk and a young mama who had been working with the well-known Latin American airline, Fawcett Airways. Ostensibly to assure the success of his new venture, this man remained in Gandia for several months and visited all major companies in an attempt to sell them special air services with his company by using small aircraft and one or two old World War II flying boat PBYs could provide for them. Pat Tillman. He became a regular figure in town and was accepted as a hard-working, friendly businessman who knew Latin America and who could speak fluent Spanish. Otherwise, he stayed in the background and was rarely seen in the official American community. He seemed to know no one at the embassy, and they were never seen with him. He was gathering intelligence, and he was an old professional. He had a drop for routine messages with the agency's communications man sent through the special CIA transmitter in the embassy, but even the CIA people in Gandia did not know that he had his own network for highly classified messages out of Peguon. He would fly more frequently so that when he had important messages, his sudden departure would not be noticed by the Guardians or the Americans. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force major had been introduced through Air Force channels. He was technically an overage in Gandia and was carried on temporary duty status there for the duration of the civic action exercises, which was scheduled to last throughout the year. He was assigned to the U.S. Air Force Special Air Warfare Unit in Panama. He was a longtime CIA employee who had served in many countries and was one of their best career pilots and black flight specialists. Although firm intelligence had shown the possibility that the old president was apt to be overthrown because of incipient developments, there were no reliable indications which would identify a possible successor. This left the agency with the option of waiting to see who might rise to power by his own ability, or of stepping in with an attempt to create a man who could take over when the president's position became dangerously weakened. The former choice was poor because it left the door open for other interests, always considered to be Castroite or communists, to step in with their own man. Since the agency believed the fall of the present government to be about as certain as such a thing could be, it was decided to use the Magsaysay formula and to create the next president by making him the hero of the people throughout the country as the first step. I wonder where we're at this point in the game. It would be the job of a major to groom the man they had selected for the role. The major did not know the American businessman who was president of the small airline and had never come across him during his agency career. The airline president did not know him either. The agency planned to keep them working independently so that it could cross-check their reports. The major had met the Army colonel during airdrop exercises at Fort Bragg, but he thought he was a real Army Special Forces instructor and did not know that he too was a CIA career man. Surprise! You're now part of the secret team and you did not even agree to it, and now you're forced into it for the rest of your life. Otherwise, you are over. The agency gave him clearance to work with the colonel very closely and cleared the colonel similarly. The major did not know of the colonel's role with the old president, and the colonel did not know the major's assignment. Each man was to play his role straight. The ambassador was fully informed of the agency's plan since he was the recipient of its secret intelligence reports, and he knew the man. He had never made an attempt to determine which man it was because he thought his charge d'affaires knew, but also it would be better for him to keep his fingers out of that kind of thing. He did not know that the major, the colonel, and the airline president were CIA men. He did not see their message traffic, although the agency took pains to make sure that he received clean copies of their dispatches, which he assumed had been culled from attached reports and other more or less normal sources. Don't speak, don't tell, or something like that. What is that? The ambassador was not interested in intelligence. He had been in the country only 1 year, and if he could keep things calm, he hoped to be transferred at the end of the second year. He was a political appointee and not a career man. The major spent a considerable amount of time setting up elaborate civic action exercises in all areas of the country. These were staged like carnivals, and at the climax of every operation, General El Ciario would fly in and address the village and local tribesmen where there had been a few native uprisings, and some operations were directed into those areas to impress the villagers with the power of their new air force. The major found a village that lived in fear of bandit tribes. Here he took a page from the Magsaise's book and rigged some early morning attacks by what he called the red team. Those attacks were always repulsed by a blue team, which just happened to be in the area. In every case, El Ciario would show up leading the victorious anti-guerrillas. The unwitting natives took this as the real thing, and the fame of General El Ciario is the greatest guerrilla fighter since Simon Bolivar spread throughout the country. We're on page 100. All right, y'all. We're going to hang up and we'll continue on with our next chapter.